All right, we're going to read the second half of Titanic, Disaster at Sea. So we are starting on Sunday, April 14th. The fated day dawns. Although the outward southern track skirted to the south of the main sea ice areas, it was well known that icebergs were still likely to be encountered, particularly in the months of April, May, and June. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. on Sunday, April 14th, the Marconi operators received a Morse code message from Captain Barr, commander of the steamship Caronia, saying, "Captain, Titanic. Westboard steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north from 49 degrees to 51 degrees west, 14th April. Compliments, Barr." This was almost exactly where the Titanic was headed. During the course of that day, half a dozen more messages containing warnings of ice ahead were received by the radio operators. All messages about navigation were supposed to be passed on to the ship's captain, who should then have made sure they were posted in the chart room on the ship's bridge, so that all the officers would be able to read them. There was no proper system in place to do this, however. Some of the messages certainly did not reach the captain. One from the Baltic was handed to Captain Smith about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, though not posted in the chart room until 7:15 that evening. Some, though, almost certainly never left the Marconi room. Evening falls. Even though not all of the messages had gotten through to them, the ship's officers knew to be on the lookout for ice. They had an added warning since the temperature started to drop very sharply after sunset. Although there was virtually no wind, this was a good, though not certain, sign that ice was around. For the first part of the evening, everything went normally. All the Titanic's boilers had been fired up, and she was now steaming ahead at over 22 knots. At 9 p.m., the captain, who had been dining with some of the first-class passengers, came to the bridge and discussed the conditions with the second officer, Charles Lightoller, who had been on the watch since 6 p.m. They both agreed that the very calm sea and the fact that there was no moon might make it difficult to spot any icebergs, especially ones that had recently turned over. These looked black or dark blue rather than white, and would not show up easily in the starlight. If there had not been any wind, even a slight breeze, there would have been waves lapping around the base of the bergs, forming white breakers that would have been much easier to spot from a distance. At 9:30 p.m., the captain retired to his cabin on the boat deck, saying, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. I will be just inside. The lookouts in the crow's nest keep watch for the icebergs." Immediately after this, Lightoller sent a message to the two lookouts in the crow's nest to keep a sharp eye out for particularly growlers, small icebergs that just barely show above the surface. In the Marconi room, the chief operator, Jack Phillips, was busy clearing a backlog of passenger messages when he received a communication at 9:40 p.m. from the Mesaba, mentioning heavy packed ice and a great number of large icebergs in an area directly ahead of the Titanic. But again, the information did not find its way to the officers on duty. At 10 o'clock, the watch changed. Lookouts Archie Jewell and George Simmons handed over to Reynold Lee and Frederick Fleet, taking care to pass on Lightoller's instructions. In the difficult conditions, it seemed a particular shame that the crow's nest binoculars were missing. Down below, on the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch took over from Lightoller. The message ignored. Jack Phillips was still in the Marconi room, sending messages for passengers at 11 o'clock p.m. Suddenly a ship, the Californian, burst in from close by with a message that went, "Say, we are surrounded by ice and stopped." Was short for old man, which was how the operators addressed each other. Phillips, evidently tired after a long day and irritated at being interrupted, snapped back, "Shut up, shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." He meant he was sending messages to Cape Race, a transmitting station on land in Newfoundland. He seems to have ignored the Californian's message and gone on with his work. Over on the Californian, the Marconi operator, Cyril Evans, did not bother to reply but turned off his machine and went to bed. The final hours. It's hard to piece together exactly what happened next. During the last 2 or 3 hours that the Titanic was afloat, pretty much everything that we know is based on the accounts of survivors. In the confusion and mounting panic, it's not surprising that stories often do not quite add up and that different people tell different versions of events. Still, there are things that everyone more or less agrees on, or that there's no strong reason to disbelieve. Iceberg ahead, 11:39 p.m. Just before 20 to midnight from his position in the crow's nest, Fred Fleet thought that he saw something indistant straight ahead, rapidly getting closer. He quickly rang the bell above his head 3 times, the signal for an object ahead. Then he picked up the telephone and called the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." Murdoch at once gave the order, "Hard a starboard," to the steersman, and phoned down to the engine room, ordering, "Stop, full steam astern." Putting the engines into reverse and turning the wheel to starboard had the effect of slowing the ship down and turning her to the left. At the same time as issuing these orders, Murdoch had pulled the lever that automatically closed the watertight doors in the bulkheads. Make sure you're looking at the images showing you what exactly is happening right down here. So here's the iceberg and here is the ship. Titanic's engines are put into reverse and the wheel turned to starboard. Fatal collision, 11:40 p.m. Slowly the ship began to swing to the left. The iceberg loomed even closer. To the lookouts it seemed as if the turn was too slow and a head-on collision was inevitable. But at the last second, the Titanic's bow passed to the left of the berg. Perhaps the turn had been enough. It was a close shave, though, and the immense black shape seemed to brush against the ship as it glided swiftly past and then disappeared into the night. The whole incident had taken scarcely a minute. All over the ship, people felt something, although few knew what. One passenger later described it as feeling as if the ship had ran over 1,000 marbles. Another as it had been hit by a heavy wave. While Lucy Dove Gordon said it was as though someone had drawn a giant finger along the ship's side. Captain Smith evidently realized that something had happened. He rushed onto the bridge and asked what the ship had hit. "An iceberg, sir," replied Murdoch. So the Titanic slows and turns to the left and appears to just have missed the iceberg. "11:50 p.m. Flooding begins. To most people on board, it had seemed as if whatever had happened could not be that serious. Deep down inside the ship, it was a very different matter. In boiler room number 6, toward the front of the ship, there had been a loud crash, and seawater had suddenly started to pour in along the right-hand side. Almost immediately, the watertight doors and the bulkheads had begun to close. 2 men, fireman Fred Barrett and engineer James Hasketh, had just enough time to dash through the doorway into the boiler room number 5. before the doors slammed shut behind them. Other men had to clamber up emergency ladders and escape through hatchways in the ceiling. Farther forward, water was flooding into the area where the mail was stored and sorted, and it was starting to seep into some of the third-class cabins and firemen's sleeping quarters. Damage discovered, 12 a.m. As soon as it became clear on the bridge that the ship was taking on water, the captain called for Thomas Andrews, and the two of them made an inspection below decks. When Captain Smith returned to the bridge, it was obvious he knew that the ship was doomed. In the passing, the iceberg had opened up the side of the ship below the water line. In the first 6 of the watertight compartments, along a length of some 100 yards or so, the hole in the 6th compartment was tiny, a gash some 23 inches long near the bulkhead, and could easily be dealt with by pumps. But the damage to the other compartments was more severe, and water was rushing in at unstoppable rate. As these compartments filled, the weight of the water was gradually pulling the front of the ship down. Eventually, the water would start to spill over the bulkhead, separating the 5th compartment from the 6th, which in turn would start to fill, pulling the ship even farther down at the front. Soon the 17th compartment would start to flood, then the 8th. Seawater spills to other compartments, and the flooding to the first 6 compartments would pull down the front of the ship. Save our souls, 12:05 a.m. At around 5 past midnight, and the order was given to uncover the lifeboats. At 1/4 midnight, the captain told the Marconi officers to send the International Distress Call, CQD. The call was picked up by Cape Race and by several ships that responded almost immediately, saying that they were changing course and heading for the Titanic. Unfortunately, all of them were several hours steaming away. At 25 past midnight, the wireless operator of the Carpathia, who had not heard the first call, sent a casual message to the Titanic. Immediately, Phillips, a chief Marconi officer, shot back, "Come at once. We have struck a berg and require immediate assistance. It's a CQD. OM." Remember, that means old man. Soon the Carpathia responded that she was about 50 miles away and coming as fast as she could. The Marconi operators continued to transmit desperate calls for help, at one point using the new SOS signal as well as the traditional CQD. Abandoned ship, 12:45 a.m. At about 1:45, Quartermaster George Rowe began sending up distress rockets at regular intervals from a position at the front of the boat deck. These shot into the air and exploded in a cascade of white stars. It seemed that rockets were seen by a crew on the Californian, still stuck in the ice to the north. But for one reason or another, Stanley Lord, the Californian's captain, took no action. While the Marconi operators were busy at their machine, efforts were being made to get the passengers and crew and get them into life jackets and start loading the 20 lifeboats. It was, by all accounts, a slow start. Gradually, though, more and more first and second class passengers began to emerge from their staterooms and gather on the decks and in the public rooms. Most had been in bed at the time of the collision. Some had on just their bedclothes, perhaps with a coat flung over the top, while others had carefully dressed themselves in layer upon layer of warm clothing. The Titanic's musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, hastily assembled in the first-class lounge and began playing lively ragtime tunes. This is showing where all these lifeboats are out. It says the 16 standard lifeboats 1 through 16. So 1 starts here, 15, 16. 4 collapsible lifeboats are up front. It's A, B, C, and D. Insignificant lifeboats, 12:45 a.m. Of course, though, Andrews, Bruce Ismay, and the senior officers had known from the start that there weren't nearly enough places in the lifeboats for all the people on board the Titanic. But it's pretty certain that at this stage, hardly anyone else, not even most of the crew, realized this. The evacuation was not very organized. Each lifeboat had designated crew members who were supposed to man it if it had to be launched. But often men had not checked the list and did not know which boat was theirs. Charles Lightoller took overall charge of the lifeboats on the left-hand side of the boat deck, and William Murdoch did all of those on the right. Their job was to ensure that the boats were manned, load passengers into them, and see them safely launch, while at the same time keeping order and making sure that panic did not break out. None of this was easy to start with. A few people appreciated the danger they were in. Wasn't the Titanic supposed to be pretty much unsinkable? Even when the seriousness of the situation began to dawn, for many people it seemed more sensible to stay on board rather than risk casting themselves off into the dark of the icy Atlantic in a rickety little lifeboat. So this is showing how the total lifeboat capacity was 1,178. How 2,207 people were on board, and the red is the amount of people that were left over. Lifeboat launching, 12:45 a.m. Still at about the same time as the SOS was being sent, the first lifeboat was launched. The order for filling the lifeboats was strictly women and children first. For Lightoller, this meant that no male passengers whatsoever should be allowed into the lifeboats, while Murdoch evidently decided that if there were no women or children nearby, then a few male passengers might be allowed on. The first half dozen boats to be launched had almost entirely first-class passengers and some crew members in them. None of them was anywhere near full. The worst was number 1, which was launched from Murdoch's side of the ship at about 10 past 1. It contained just 7 crew members and 4 first-class passengers. Later boats generally had more people in them and a higher proportion of second and third-class passengers. As the Titanic's boat sank even further into the water and it became increasingly obvious that there were not enough lifeboats, the scene became more and more desperate. Margaret Brown later told how she was willfully pushed forward and dropped into lifeboat number 6 before she had time to protest. The bitter end, 1:50 a.m. By about 10 to 2, the forecastle deck at the front of the ship had disappeared under water. 10 minutes later, the water had reached A deck, just below the boat deck. The last lifeboat to be successfully launched from the Davit's collapsible lifeboat D was lowered into the sea at about 5 past 2, and almost immediately afterward, water started to pour onto the boat deck at the front end. At this point, men were still struggling with collapsible lifeboats A and B, which had been heaved off the roof of the officers' quarters. Amazingly, the lights under the ship were still blazing. Engineers under Chief Engineer Joseph Bell worked until the very last minute in the engine room, determined to keep the power going. The Marconi operators continued frantically tapping out messages. The last one received by another ship was sent at 10 past 2. Hundreds and hundreds of people had gathered on the deck. Some were praying, some weeping and crying for help. Others just huddled silently together. The ship's band was standing near the base of the second funnel, playing a solemn tune, probably the hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee. Gone, 12:15 a.m. At about 2:15, the bridge at the front of the boat deck sank under the water. This put tremendous strain on the cables securing the forward funnel. One by one they snapped, and with a groan the funnel broke away. Charles Lightoller, who was on the roof of the officers' quarters at the time, recalled that the ship had then gave a sudden lurch, creating a wave that washed the 2 remaining collapsible lifeboats off the deck. Shortly afterwards, a loud rumbling sound, like distant thunder, was heard heard from deep down in the bowels of the ship. By now the lights had finally gone out, and everything was in darkness. The back end of the boat deck was still far above the water, while the front end had disappeared from view. Some survivors maintained that at this point the ship's stern seemed to settle back down in the water for a while. Others, including Lightoller, disagreed and instead remembered that the ship continuing to tip up even ever more steeply. Whatever the case, the end now came very fast. By 20 past 2, the last vestige of the Titanic had slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic. So this enormous ship has broken up and disappeared underwater, and it all happened in under 3 hours. It's amazing how many people did survive. A watery grave, 2:30 a.m. The aftermath was ghastly. All those who had been left on the great ship had been plunged into the freezing water. Many were undoubtedly killed or badly injured as they fell or were sunk under the sinking ship. Of the rest, some thrashed about calling for help, while others clung desperately onto the floating wreckage or to each other. The two collapsible lifeboats formed a refuge for a few lucky souls, but the extreme cold of the water meant that for virtually everyone else it was soon the end. Only one of the lifeboats that had been launched, number 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back to try to rescue people. Survivors and all the others were apparently afraid that their boats would be swamped if they returned. 4 people were pulled from the water alive into lifeboat number 14, but one of these died soon afterwards. The rescue mission, 2:40 a.m. Still some way to the south, Captain Ross Strone on the Carpathia was steaming toward the Titanic's position. At 22:03 in the morning, he had spotted a green flare on the horizon and hoped that this meant the Titanic was still afloat. He pressed his ship on the maximum speed, although she was now in the ice field and constantly having to dodge icebergs and growlers herself. Meanwhile, the crew was discreetly preparing the Carpathia for a possible rescue operation. Lights were being strung along the ship's sides. Lifeboats swung out in preparation for launching. Ladders put at the ready and slings prepared for hoisting any injured aboard. Blankets were being piled up into the public rooms, hot drinks prepared, and the ship's 3 doctors put on standby. Every now and again, another green flare was spotted by the Carpathia, which itself was letting off colored rockets and flares in response. But by 4 o'clock, the ship had reached the Titanic's last known position and found nothing. The green flares were, in fact, being set off by 4th Officer Joseph Boxall in lifeboat number 2. At 4:05, Boxall let off the last of his flares, and the boat was spotted in the breaking down by the Carpathia. The liner slowly made her way to the lifeboat, dodging an iceberg in the process, and at 4:10, the first of the Titanic survivors were taken on board. Over the next 4 hours, all the other lifeboats were tracked down, and everyone was brought onto the Carpathia. In all, 711 people were rescued. Although one of these died while the Carpathia was heading back to New York, in the end of one of the greatest ever sea disasters, with 1,496 people lost to the icy waters, the world of the great ocean liners would never be the same again. The inquiry. The American inquiry into the tragedy, led by Senator William Alden Smith, began on April 19th, the day after the Carpathia arrived back to New York, and lasted until May 25th. The British inquiry, held by the Board of Trade with Lord Mersey in charge, was even longer, lasting from May 2nd until July 3rd. Each inquiry interviewed dozens of witnesses, including survivors, experts in shipbuilding and navigation, and officers from the Californian and Carpathia. They both produced lengthy reports. The British one runs to nearly 1,000 pages and came to similar conclusions. They decided that no one could have foreseen the accident and that in the end no one was to blame, although they thought that Captain Smith was unwise to have continued steaming at such a speed when it was known that there was ice in the area. Both inquiries praised the captain and the crew of the Carpathia, believing that many more people would have died without their speedy and decisive action. But both heavily criticized Captain Lord of the Californian, who they believed should have realized that a ship was in terrible trouble nearby and gone to its assistance. Naturally, the question of the number of lifeboats was raised. In fact, several people expressed the view that even if there had been many more lifeboats, not everyone would necessarily have been saved, as there was barely enough time to launch even the boats that were on board. Of course, several hundred more people would have survived if lifeboats had actually been full when they were launched. Despite concerns about practically the practicality, the big liners, including the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, were quickly fitted out with extra lifeboats, as passengers and crew were reluctant to sail without them. The Titanic sinking had other consequences too. Ship designs were modified in response, so that more were built now. More were now built with complete double hulls and watertight bulkheads, and ships like the Oceanic were raised so that their tops were much higher above the waterline. The accident also led to the creation of the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, whose member countries agreed on safety regulations for passengers and cargo ships, and to the setting up of the International Ice Patrol, which is to the present day keeps a watch in the North Atlantic for icebergs that might pose a danger to shipping. Survivors of the Titanic disaster. The pink is women, the blue is men, and it's dividing it up by first class, second class, third class, and the crew. So these are the people saved up top and the people lost down below. One controversy that both inquiries looked into was whether the third-class passengers were unfairly treated. It is certainly true that a much higher proportion of first and second-class passengers survived. Virtually all the first and second-class women and children survived, but fewer than half of those in third class did. Among men, it was a bit different. A third of the first-class men and 1 in 7 of the third-class men survived, but fewer than 1 in 10 of the second-class men did. The British inquiry at least concluded that the third class had not been actively discriminated against, but it remains true that not much effort seems to have been made to help them while the ship was sinking. The lifeboats were on the boat deck, reserved for the first and second class, and mainly third-class passengers would have been reluctant to go up there without permission. Besides, the layout of the ship was confusing, with no clear route from their cabins up to the boat deck. At least some of the possible routes were apparently blocked for some time by locked gates. What's more, many of the third-class passengers understood little or no English and would have found it difficult to grasp what was going on until it was too late. The wreck. Advances in submarine technology after the Second World War meant that it became feasible to send craft down to the vast depths at which the Titanic's wreck was thought to lie. However, it was not until 1985 that the ship was finally discovered, lying at a depth of nearly 2.5 miles, some distance away from where it previously had thought to be, and deteriorating fast. The discovery confirmed that the Titanic had been broken into as it sank, something that had been argued about for years. The two parts lie more than 1,900 feet apart at the face in opposite directions, with a mass of debris strewn between them. Particular attention was paid to the part of the hull holed in the collision. It was already known that the total area opened was a tiny, about 3 square feet. Experts had assumed that the hull's steel plates were gashed open, but it was discovered that, in fact, the iceberg had made them buckle, not tear, shearing off rivets and opening up seams between them. Chemical analysis of the rivets and steel plates show that they were made of less refined metal than modern equivalents and were more prone to corrode and weaken in seawater. Since the Titanic disaster was nearly 100 years ago, there have been many bigger ships built and several far worse catastrophes at sea. Nevertheless, the Titanic still exerts a powerful grip on the imagination. Hundreds of books have been written, films made, websites created, and many materials obsessively collected. Many objects have been retrieved from the wreck itself, although this is a subject of great controversy, and shown in exhibits that have attracted tens of thousands of people. One reason for all this interest must be that the history of the ship provides endless opportunities to think about what might have been. What if the binoculars had not gone missing, and the iceberg had been spotted nearly 30 seconds earlier? What if the rivets and the steel of the hull had been to modern standards? What if there had been enough lifeboats for everyone on board? And what if the Californian had not mysteriously failed to respond to the distress signal its crew had seen? To these and many other questions about the sinking of what is surely the most famous ship in history, we will never know the answers.